What is development?
In general, development refers to the process or act of changing or growing of something. In an international relations aspect, it refers to the changes of a person or a country based on their choices and capabilities and what they are able to change. It also conveys something about the capacity of economic, political and social systems to change to provide the circumstances for that development on a sustainable long-term basis.
What is aid?
In a general sense, aid refers to providing what is useful or necessary to achieve an end. In terms of international relations and politics, it is when an outside country or body enacts change within another country through the implication of resources. This process removes a proportion of sovereignty from the recipient.
Development in Syria.
With regards to the implications of development within Syria, the Syrian civil war, it is very easy to say that the increased number of white helmets present within the war are very positive development. They came into being in 2014, and since then the number has increased tenfold of people who are risking their lives almost every single day to find survivors in the rubble of bomb hits. Sometimes it takes them up to 72 hours to find people without stopping. I know that sounds impossible, but it's actually not, apparently. The number has gone from being only 20 people, 20 volunteers, to having almost 3,000 volunteers. The man who founded the group, James LeMessurier, who is a former British Army officer and is now a consultant within the Syrian Watch Group of the UN, he said about the group, they are all a very diverse and disparate group of individuals, all of whom made individual choices. They all had the choice whether or not they want to pick up a gun to become a refugee, but they've all made a choice to instead pick up a stretcher. While the origins of the group were international, by membership, the group is very Syrian. It is made up of people from all types of Syrian communities, and these people have chosen to save others instead of fight. Since the group was formed, more than 62,000 people have been rescued. British MP Joe Cox nominated the group for a Nobel Peace Prize right before he was killed and stated, "When the bombs rain down, the Syrian Civil Defense, as they are actually known, that is their official name, they rush in. In the most dangerous place on earth, these unarmed volunteers risk their life to help people in need, regardless of religion or politics." This group is very much so a development in the humanitarian aspect of the civil war, because they risk their lives to help anyone, regardless of what their agenda is, which I think a lot of other people would agree is somewhat majestic, and it's quite nice, actually. It's a nice thing to think. However, since the group was formed, they've been receiving a lot of smack and backlash for their efforts. Numerous people claim that they are American puppets and are therefore actually in support of jihadists, even though the group explicitly stands against extremism and violence and was actually founded on those principles that are against extremism and violence. They were once funded by the US, but as of March this year, the Trump administration has frozen a $200 million American US dollars package of US aid to Syria, which I know is an aid aspect, however, which included money for the white helmets. The US has given the group $33 million to date, and the freeze puts projects like the demining and the restoration of water and power supplies at risk, which, if you will reflect back on a couple of weeks ago, we actually talked about the contamination of water, which that's what the money would have gone to. And when the 2016 Netflix documentary was released about the White Helmets, it was met with great controversy, as a lot of people believed it to be a Western bias of the group, which it very much probably was so, because it was made by Western people. Furthermore, the group was however, With the recent media that is coming to light, it is getting easier to see how the White Helmets have been a beneficial moral development with regards to the conflict in Syria. That is, they are actually of benefit to the moral aspect. And I'm sure that that's probably a very bad word to use actually with regards to the entire Syrian issue, but I believe that not just myself, every article I've read has been in support of the White Helmets and the fact that they are doing good. Now, there have been some people that have said this is actually the worst thing that could possibly come out of. They're actually just, they're puppets of the Western world. They would have to be, because to get funding, arguably they kind of have to. The White Helmets are in almost every single aspect of the word moral. They are a development within this Syrian civil war because they have helped. They have saved 62,000 people and counting. It is probably also worth mentioning that they are unable to work in ISIS-controlled regions of Syria, as they have just recently been kicked out, and they are regularly attacked over many years. And they are very much so a moral development, positive moral development for the Syrian civil war, as they're possibly the little good to come out of this entire thing, which I think speaks highly, very highly of the entire project.
The Syrian civil war is a well-known conflict and is highly topical around the world. The stories that are heard over the news are absolutely heartbreaking, and lots of people are at a loss as to how the issue can be overcome. Obviously, with something as large as this, aid is really relied upon by those in the middle of the conflict. With war raging around them, normal people and the civilians need for aid systems to be put in place so that they can maintain things like food and water. The Syrian conflict has created the worst humanitarian crisis of our time. More than 11 million people have been killed or forced to flee their homes. So, what are other global actors doing to help Syria and those in Syria who are helpless? Well, currently the big debate in terms of aid in Syria is America's withdrawal of aid from northwest Syria. The United States has stated that they are withdrawing assistance from northwest Syria as the Trump administration reviews money used for the stabilization of Syria. This is said to come from US-led military coalition battling the remaining elements of ISIS in other areas of Syria. An official has said that, quote, US assistance for programs in northwest Syria are being freed up to provide potential increased support for priorities in northeast Syria. President Donald Trump has repeatedly stated that it is now time for the Arab allies in the area to take action and help Syria. He believes that this will allow for the United States to focus their priorities elsewhere where ISIS does have a stronghold. However, there is concern that withdrawal of aid from America will decrease American influence and result in an outcome that does not cooperate or align with longer-term US interests. Syria is quite a large country, so overcoming the civil war is a tremendous task. They may overcome ISIS in one region and have to then focus on another, but the region that is just been, bedded, then faces the struggles of recovery. Society has to rebuild itself, social structures have to be applied again, and so much more. So, in the instance of northwest Syria, things may be better there, and there may be areas where help is needed more urgently, but northwest Syria then faces the problems associated with post-war. Post-war reconstruction is extremely challenging as it means that Following this extremely traumatic crisis, society has to rebuild itself, which obviously is quite a challenge because all structures that were in place are obviously no longer in place. Further, who is to determine that the crisis is actually resolved in northwest Syria, and how can stabilisation be achieved without the assistance of some form of external force, someone to guide these people? These are all questions that have to be asked and have to be challenged in regards to the Syrian crisis, because how will the removal of aid affect not only this area, but the crisis as a whole? This is when we realise how many layers and how complicated aid actually is, because there's lots of places that need aid, but there's not necessarily, like America might not necessarily have the capability or the willingness to provide aid in all of these areas. So it just shows the complexity of aid and how much thought has to go into it, I guess.
Development in the Rohingya crisis.
The implications of development within the Rohingya issue in Myanmar has had no effect, little to no effect. According to many articles and journalists specialising in the issue, the crisis within the Rakhine state of Myanmar, the northern Rakhine state that borders with Bangladesh, is growing at alarming rates rather than decreasing. Aung San Suu Kyi, the de facto leader of Myanmar, who is technically the actual leader, has recently investigated into the issue, and by recent I mean 2016. Since then there has been nothing. But since then she has been silent on what is happening. She commissioned a special inquiry headed by her foreign minister into what is happening there, and has had since almost no formal news about what is happening. When the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, known as ASEAN, states met up, Australia, who isn't part of it, urged regional leaders around Myanmar, so the countries bordering, to stop the country from getting away with, in quotations, mass murder and displacement of thousands of Rohingya refugees, in quotations. International development actors are pouring money, heaps of money, into projects aimed at supporting people in the northern Rakhine state, yet very few Rohingya remain due to the fact that they have been driven out by ethnic cleansing, which is the very general term we're going to put around it. Development aid, the aid that is being sent there, is not addressing the real problem. That the government of Myanmar refuses any protection or recognition for the Rohingya people that would allow them to safely return. Now, while that aspect there, that the government is refusing any protection, is remotely true, it's also, that's a very heavy quote to put on it, which I disagree with slightly, because everything else points to the fact that the government is broken, so you can't really fix that. While I do agree that development in the Rakhine state needs to be supported in the long term, there needs to be more focus on addressing the immediate and urgent needs that are required. From my understanding, Aung San Suu Kyi, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, is technically in charge of Myanmar. However, the military is still a very big force, as they control home affairs, defence and border affairs. Home affairs refers to the police. The military is in control in the Rakhine state, as it borders Bangladesh, and due to the fact that there is an increasing number of police presence there, and technically defence presence there. So she has had very little control over what happens there, because technically at the moment in Myanmar, there are two sides of the government. There is Aung San Suu Kyi, who technically is in charge, and then there's the military, who are a major player within the government and the distribution of power within Myanmar, which in a way does actually blatantly disrespect the points of having a democracy, which Myanmar is, and that is where the separation of power isn't actually working. If Aung San Suu Kyi did speak out in support of the Rohingya, That would prompt an angry response from many Buddhist military officials and almost surely make things more difficult in Rohingya. Make things more difficult for the Rohingya. The issue of development with the Rohingyas all up is difficult to ascertain whether a positive outcome is likely to happen. While Aung San Suu Kyi wants to do something, she is unable, due to, as I said before, the broken methods of government in Myanmar, formerly known as Burma. In 2016, a senior UN official told the BBC the new military offensive was a textbook example of an ethnic cleansing, something Myanmar denies and still denies up until this date. Not this date, but up until May it had denied it. Nothing new has come from since then. Critics say, it's still technically May, wow. Critics say Suu Kyi isn't doing nearly as much as she could be. She claims that the military is operating according to the law. However, following the deaths of 9 police officers, a massive security operation was launched and more than 100 people from the Rohingya side were killed, which really plays into that new military offensive that is a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. Tun Khin from the Burmese Rohingya organisation UK said that Suu Kyi's failure to defend the Rohingya was extremely disappointing. Quotations. The point is that Aung San Suu Kyi is covering up this crime perpetrated by the military, he said. That is very much true. Could be perpetrated by the military. However, I'm not sure that that's the full story that is actually happening there. All in all, development in Myanmar with reference to the Rohingya crisis has been next to nothing. Every day, more and more people are dying, and the government is doing next to nothing about it, which, despite the pressure that they are receiving from people all around the world. Even the Dalai Lama has had a word to Suu Kyi twice about the issue, and to which she said on both occasions she is working it out. Just as a fun fact, Suu Kyi won the Nobel Peace Prize for her work in fighting for democracy in her country, and her country is now a democracy. But people are now saying, which also, due to this fighting, she was then imprisoned for 20 years. But people are now saying that this Peace Prize should be revoked due to her being almost complicit in the events in the Rakhine State, which kind of goes against the whole aspect of democracy. Furthermore, according to the World Bank, the refugee crisis in Cox's Bazar, where there is a major influx of Rohingya refugees spreading to, as it is very close to the border of Bangladesh and Myanmar, there is an urgent need for extra support as Bangladesh is unable to manage the extreme amount of refugees. Bangladesh is holding and is looking after this major influx of refugees, as they are very much so being very hospitable towards all these refugees, and I feel like that's a very important aspect that we should acknowledge. All in all, the development in Myanmar has had little to no effect within the whole issue of the Rohingyas. This, I want to say issue again, but it's probably a bit too much of a broad sense of the word. This crisis and this ethnic cleansing, as I believe that is a very strong word and a very accurate word to use, is not being fixed. We could fix it, we could try and fix it, we could try and intervene, but then that would breach Myanmar's sovereignty, which wouldn't really look well for the rest of the world. So the development side of the Rohingya issue isn't looking so good. It's looking pretty negative. Oh, and just another fun fact. To this date, there's been 62,000 people that have died. I believe around there, 62,000 people. And the issue started in 2014, and that's a big number of people to die. That's a fairly large number.
Aid in the Rohingya crisis.
Rohingya refugees are in dire need of aid. Hundreds of thousands of these refugees are streaming across the border into Bangladesh, fleeing from the violence of their home. These people who have been forced to leave their home are in urgent need of support and assistance. Those involved in aid programs, such as aid agencies, are struggling to sufficiently serve and cater for 1.3 million people who depend on this aid, including those in local communities. Canada is one of the key countries and a key player in contributing to aid in the Rohingya crisis. Recently, Canada's federal government have announced that they will be committing $300 million over the next 3 years. This is in response to the Rohingya crisis that has forced more than 700,000 members of this ethnic minority to leave Myanmar due to violence which is occurring. This money will fund efforts to hold perpetrators of these human rights violations against the Rohingya to account. Ms. Freeland has described these gross violations as ethnic cleansing. Further, the Canadian government will work alongside the United Nations Refugee Agency and the Bangladeshi government to explore the opportunity for resettling some Rohingya refugees in Canada. No exact amount of people or when this would occur has been determined yet, but the option is being explored and discussed. Furthermore, US government's aid chief has called on Myanmar to end violence against the Rohingya Muslim minority and to provide humanitarian workers and media to have access to the country, as currently it can be quite challenging for people to actually come in and make a difference. The United States would provide $44 million in additional aid to assist meeting the needs of the Rohingya refugees. Further, US President Donald Trump assured Bangladesh of US support in dealing with the Myanmar refugee crisis. Here, America is offering both an economic and financial assistance, as well as that diplomatic and political advice and assistance, which would be helpful. Officials have warned that cyclone and monsoon season could destroy makeshift homes and cause diseases to spread faster in camps where the Rohingya refugees are currently living. UK is helping vaccinate people against a cholera outbreak, strengthening shelters and providing food and water to Rohingya families. The $70 million, which was part of a $129 million contribution that the UK has made since August of 2017, will assist 200,000 people in accessing vital materials to strengthen their shelters, and a further 300,000 people in accessing food and water.
Development in South Sudan.
As far as the implications of development within South Sudan, development is not occurring. South Sudan is simply not experiencing development with its civil war. It is currently entering its fifth year of war, and it is currently considered one of the most dangerous places for aid workers. Maternal rates are at an all-time high due to many of the very few existing medical facilities being poorly equipped and very sparse. Over the many years, many medical facilities have been shut down due to lack of funding, lack of support, and due to the fact that the government believes that they are actually from the other side, which is very much open for interpretation. Since the war began, actually not just since the war began, but as a result of the war, 1.25 million people are on the brink of starvation. That is the newest figure as of November last year. There has been no new figures, and people are afraid to grow food, because if they do and they are caught, they will be labelled rebels by the government. Since South Sudan slid into a civil war, more than 4 million people have died, which is about a third of the population, just to put that in perspective. As an arguably positive development, South Sudan has requested to join the Arab League as of March this year, when Egypt's foreign minister visited the country to discuss this request. That is very much still pending, though, due to the ongoing conflict that is happening. And as another positive development, arguably, UN investigators say that they have identified more than 40 South Sudanese military officers who may be responsible for the countless war crimes and crimes against humanity in the conflict in South Sudan. Previous UN reports have only named and documented the crimes, not the perpetrators, so this, in a way, is very much a positive development. So that we, from our perspective, our Western bias perspective, are able to see, yeah, okay, so things aren't looking too bad there. Although a spokesperson from the foreign ministry, from South Sudan's foreign ministry, said that the government will hold the people responsible, since then, very few have actually been prosecuted and have actually been found guilty for their crimes against civilians. The report also documents what the Commission member Andrew Clapham called a clear pattern of ethnic persecution, for the most part by government forces who should be pursued for crimes against humanity. Despite a 2015 peace deal being signed by both sides of the conflict, the civil war is ongoing and doesn't appear to be stopping. In many ways, the development in South Sudan is pretty much non-existent, considering that very high figure of people who are on the brink of starvation. Most people rely on the help of aid workers, as they are unable.
Aid in South Sudan.
7 million people in South Sudan are requiring humanitarian assistance. 5.3 million people are in need of food assistance in South Sudan. 204,000 individuals are seeking refuge. There are 2.43 million refugees and asylum seekers from South Sudan in neighbouring countries. All of these facts highlight the enormity of the South Sudan civil war and the implications that it's had on the community. The United States has been, and still is, a major contributor to aid in South Sudan. However, the United States may be ready to stop humanitarian aid in South Sudan after spending billions of dollars in recent years. The White House has said that, quote, "The government of South Sudan has lost credibility and the United States is losing patience. The United States government will not continue in a partnership with leaders who are only interested in perpetrating an endless war characterized by ethnically motivated atrocities." Many people believe that the removal of American aid will only send the country into further disaster, despite the fact that South Sudan's government has been accused of preventing important aid programs and prolonging violence in the country. So even though the government has been accused of stopping these aid programs, lots of people believe that if America withdraw completely from aid, the country will only go into a worse state, which is hard to imagine. Efforts to mend the situation in South Sudan has resulted in at least 50,000 people being killed in the war and millions more displaced. The UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Mark Lowcock, said that 4 aid workers have been killed and 10 others have been abducted in the last 2 months alone. He has said that officials in Juba have told him that they want humanitarian agencies to have unimpeded access to those in need. This would mean that they would have easier access and more ability to actually have an impact, a direct impact, on the crisis. Fighting has displaced nearly 4.3 million people across the country. There is a clear need for aid assistance, but with the dangers clear to aid workers, it is hard to supply these people. The announcement that America will be reviewing their assistance is supported, as it ensures that their support does not indirectly fuel the conflict. At this stage, it is important for America to be weighing up what their aid is actually doing, and for them to be considering if their aid is actually benefiting. However, lots of people are struggling with the idea that if they pull out of this aid, what's going to happen to the Sudanese people who are caught in the middle? Will they be punished simply because of the government abusing what America is providing? Yet again, these are really big questions that allow us to think about and understand the complexity of aid and the many layers that it has to it.